Hi guys, this is Anthony here. Welcome to this lesson. So I made this video series because I want to show the guys who are taking the network automation mini course. I want to show them some of those basic things that for those who are new to Python, and there are a few individuals who are going to be participating that are fairly new to Python, there's a lot of little things to cover, and I think that if I were to provide these videos, then I think you could get up to speed at least to an appropriate degree. So when we get to that piece of the course, then you're at least a little better prepared. So I broke this out into several different lessons, and the first lesson is going to be the simplest, of course. We're going to start with some very basic foundational stuff. Really, most of these are foundational, but it's intended to be a crash course where you get the most basic of things out of this that apply to the mini course, and in doing so, you're not going to be completely lost when you're observing what I show you. So in this first video, what I want to cover primarily is three different things. I want to cover how to set up an environment after you already have your Python installed, and I want to show you data types, and then finally I want to show you some iteration. All right, so once we get to the full course, I'm probably going to either use either VS Code or PyCharm, one of the two, but for now, because this is not a super complex write-up, I'm just going to stick in the interpreter. And it's a special type of interpreter that I use for this. It's called IPython. And the question is, what is IPython? Why do I use IPython over the standard Python 3? Because I can use Python 3 as well. The difference being, if you are a network guy, a network engineer, a network admin, architect, you are probably used to a autocomplete feature. So IPython provides you that autocomplete feature. So if I tab right now from J, it will provide me what possibilities I have. And that's what I was intending to type. Which is really nice, and it's a lot cooler than writing in this standard interpreter when we're in the terminal like this. So just something to keep in mind. It's pretty nice, but there's other cool little built-in components it has to it. Like, for example, there's this time it, to where you can time a set of code and then maybe compare the performance of two different setups. So now that you've seen that, you're probably wondering, how do I get IPython, assuming that I have Python installed? Well, IPython is simply just a library. So when you install libraries, you'll be using something called pip. And pip is your package manager for Python. So whenever you need a new package, new module, a new library, you will install it from pip. And what a library or module is essentially a package or a set of Python libraries, a set of basically code that's wrapped in a fancy way to where you can take that code and import it into your programs easily so you don't have to rewrite it yourself. That's really what a library is. Somebody else wrote the library, now you're importing and using their library, and it makes it easier to do certain things that, originally you may have had to write code for. So the way that you install a new library is you just say pip install and then whatever the library is. And in this case, I already have my requirements satisfied because I've already installed IPython. So you can do this for anything. There's going to be several libraries that you install starting out. And one thing that I highly recommend that you absolutely need when it comes to package management and pip package management is you need to have a requirements file. A requirements file is a file that has a list of all the packages you want for your Python setup. So once you have it like this, And what you can actually do as well, I'm not going to do it in this case, but you can actually set this to a specific version if maybe you have limitations on the version that you use for a program that you have. It's just something to keep in mind. But if you have the requirements file, instead of putting in each and every individual package on the line here, all you have to do is say pip install r requirements.txt. And as you can see, all these are already satisfied because I already installed all these packages on my Python. But this is a very useful tool to have. And whenever you are setting up your stuff on GitHub or wherever you decide to play around with your Python, having a requirements file, if you want to spin up an environment with this specific Python scripts in it that requires all these libraries, it's nice to have a requirements.txt file, especially if somebody else is going to be using your code. Then they can look at it and say, oh, these are the ones I need. I don't need to go out and pick them out. I just tie in this requirements file, and now I have what I need. So there's that. Now the next thing is, what are we going to be doing in this lecture, this lesson? What do we expect to be learning? This is the first thing that we were going to learn, and we already have. So the next thing is we are going to learn data types. And what I'm going to tell you right now is the first few lessons that we have here, they're all going to build off of each other. So this isn't going to be some boring hello world stuff. This is going to be an actual project. If you were a network guy or even a sysadmin and you want to learn Python with a project where there's actually a practical use case, this is how I teach things. Because I learn things myself through practicality. Everybody else learns things much quicker when they have something they can apply code to. Because when you first start out in doing coding, and you don't really have an idea of what it is you want to do, it's going to take a lot longer to learn. But if you have a project and you're like, this is what I want to do, then it becomes a lot easier to learn. So that's how I will be teaching this throughout all of my courses. And if I miss anything on these videos regarding the different things that you learn within Python, the different components, the data types, the iterations, the conditionals, and all that other stuff, if there's something small that you see in here that you didn't really completely understand, then let me know and send me a message on Twitter or send me an email, and I can try and help out the best I can. So the next question is, what is the practical use case we're going to be doing today? And that is, if you look over here, you will see something called Postman. So Postman is a nice way of building out a API request and getting an API response. It's much easier than doing curl, because curl is just inefficient. But this is really nice because it gives you a GUI structure for sending API requests. So over here you have the verb, the HTTP verb. We are doing get. Get just means get some information from an API endpoint. This is our API endpoint. This is the base URI right here. This is a IP for Netbox. So Netbox is, as some of you may know, it is a source of truth that contains all different kinds of things: IPAM, device management, the hardware on those devices, VRFs, VLANs, all that other stuff. All this good device network management stuff. So what I did is I put two devices into here, and in here we only have two in the full-on free mini course. There's probably more like 10 to 15 because we want to actually make the automation useful. But for the sake of this initial set of videos, we only need a very small set of data. So this, as you saw, is exactly what is reflected in this API response. And this is all in the documentation. If you want to learn what the endpoints are, you just have to read the documentation. That's all I'm going to say. So the way this is structured is you have API, which is the very top level. API DCIM is the very top level. And then devices is the resource. And you could actually dig further into this. You could say, I want a specific device, so I want device ID 1, which would be device A here. And you could pull that, but we want all devices. And the main reason we want all devices, for our example, is we can pull this response in bulk. We get all devices at once, and then we can just pick through it. If we were to pick out specific devices, we'd have to send separate API calls. So if from an efficiency standpoint, at least in this situation, it's best just to get the bulk and then parse out what we want. Now, if there was tens of thousands of entries, it would probably be better to do individual API calls, but in this case, we are okay with just doing a bulk request. So now that you've seen that, what I intend to do is teach you all the different data types. And it's interesting because this API response actually entails most of the data types you will learn. And then we will parse out a select bit of various pieces of data you will find in here. And there is an end result. And this is the end result right here. This is what we're going to end up with. We're going to end up with 2 sets of dictionaries. And we're going to parse out just 3 fields for each of the devices. And actually, this needs to be slightly different. I think it's none. So this is what we expect from this massive amount. And you're probably wondering, why is that useful? Well, you'll get to see that in the mini course if you take it. So now that you know that, let's move on to the basics of data types. So we're going to start with 2 data types. We're going to start with the string and we're going to start with the integer. And you probably already know what a string is. Your hello world string. You've probably taken that class where they say print hello world. And that's your generic print hello world in Python. And then I could assign that to a variable. And I get the same thing doing this. And then you can concatenate strings if you want to. You could say print my string plus my name, and it'll concatenate it. And actually I need a space here. And now it looks a little better. So that's string concatenation. And that's pretty much it for strings. Strings are pretty straightforward. Another thing, if you want to check it out, this is something else you should keep in mind. Looking at your data types. What is my type of my string? It is a str, which is a string. Okay. You want to know your different data types, and you want to know that type built in, because it will tell you, and sometimes you will observe a data type and it looks like one data type, but it is actually another data type. Something very important to know for later lessons. So the next thing is we want to cover integers briefly. Integers being numbers, but you already knew that. I say type, my integer, int. And then if we do concatenation with this one, oops, didn't assign it yet. And there you go. And you can do all the other standard mathematic operations. You can divide, you can subtract, you can multiply, you can do exponents. That's a pretty big exponent. So, those are some basics on the strings and integers. Now the next question is, looking up here, is there a better way to do this? And the answer is yes. This is a very inefficient way of doing string formatting. When I say string, I mean string and integers. Actually, you can take integers as well. You can't actually add an integer to a string. You will get an error if you do that, as you see. But what you can do is you can wrap this into converting it to a string data type, and then you can add those together. But there's something else called string formatting, and there are 3 options. 2 of these options are workable, but they're not the best recommendation in my opinion, and typically in Python best practice. And then one of them will be your best option. I'm going to show you all 3 because you're going to see all 3 throughout much of the code that you observe in different repositories and among those things that other developers tend to write. So what I'm going to do, what I'm going to show you is the first one, which looks like this. This is probably what you most commonly saw in Python 2, with this little percentage sign and then an S. And then if it's a number, then you can typically take, or yeah, you can actually call in a number too. But if I were to do that, it would still pass it in as a string. So you don't have to do this thing to where you modify the string like up top there. That is your second worst option. We already showed you the worst option. There's another option where you can do this. Oops. What's going on here? There we go. There's your second option. And finally, the third and best option, and one of the easier ones. Actually, I think they're all easy to read, but this one's just very simple. It's called the F string. Okay? And as you see, this is by far the easiest way to do it, because the only thing you have to do is throw an F in front of the string, and then you just pass the variables into this little squiggly brackets. This is the format you will see me use throughout everything that I do in the course. All right? So just keep that in mind. That is the best possible option you can have, is the F string. I don't believe the F string is supported in Python 2. Python 3 is what we'll be using. Okay. So, now we have covered strings. We've covered integers. I don't think we've covered floats. I'm going to very briefly cover floats. But a float is just a decimal value. So if I say my float is 1.0, what is the data type of my float? It is, we'll get that eventually. It is a float. And then if I print, well, actually, we already know what my float looks like. You can add a float to an integer. It's not an illegal operation. And as we know, adding a integer to a float is illegal. Or sorry, an integer to a string is illegal, just as a float and a string is illegal as well. Now that we've observed this, I want to move on to working with lists. Now, when it comes to, actually there is one other operation, built-in operation I want you to see as well. There is the length method, and if you want to see how long the string is, then it'll tell you. Now, if you're probably wondering, why would I use this? I'm going to give an example. Let's say you have a router or a switch or something with a host name, and there is a requirement to the length of that host name. If it is not this length, then put this into an exception list, or basically a list of exceptions. That way we know that this host name does not qualify as a based on the prerequisites we've provided. So just think of it that way. Pretty simple. All right, so now let's move on to lists. What is a list? You probably already know what a list is. It's just a set of things. So you can do it two ways. You can do it the first way, or you can do it this way. It doesn't matter. It's the same thing. Either or. Okay. We are going to determine how we add things to lists, how we pull a specific entry from a list, and how we remove entries from a list. Okay? So the first thing we're going to do is, how do we add to a list? Say my list append, and then let's append one of the variables that we used earlier called another string. Now if I say print my list, we now have an entry. So let's add another entry, but instead this time we're going to add a string. Okay, and now we have two entries. So then if I use the length method on this one, then it's going to tell me I have two entries. This can be useful as well. For example, if we have 0 entries in the list, then we can use that in a conditional, and it helps us leverage maybe if there's no data in a specific part of the API response or something like that. Okay, so there's that. Now the next thing is, how do I get a specific entry? So I will say print my list, and we're going to have a positional argument here, or a position, yeah. One thing to note within Python, and within many other programming languages, is 0 is 1. 0 is your very first position. 1 is your second position. Okay? So if you want to remove something, or if you want to call something in a list at a certain position, you start at 0. If it's the second entry, it's going to be at position 1. Does that make sense? Okay. And there is our very first entry. Now, another thing you can do is you can say, I want the last entry in my list. You say -1. And then another thing you could do, I want an entry that's the second from the last in my list, which is the first technically as well. Okay? Based on that, hopefully that makes sense. It's pretty straightforward. Nothing much to it. Now, I'm going to add one more entry into here, and this time I'm going to add an integer. Okay. I'm going to call something known as the pop operation. The pop operation is best known to removing the last entry in a list. So if I say mylist.pop, it will pop out the last entry. And as you see, append adds an entry to the end of the list. Therefore, the first entry to remove was 112. I'm going to add that back, and I'm going to show you another way of removing data. So now we know how to remove from the end of a list. How do I remove from if I already know what the value is? So for example, if I said I want to remove is my number specifically, but maybe I don't know the position of this value, but I know it's in the list. And what you could say is my list dot remove is my number. And you have now removed that specific entry in the list. Now, the question is, because I typically can append values, how do I add a value in a specific position of the list? And the way you do this is with the insert method. And it goes, the first one is the position, so 0 being the very first entry, and then adding back in is my number. And as you will see, it is back in the beginning, except I forgot to add the space. That's all good. So now you know how to look at a list. You know how to get a specific entry out of a list. You know how to pop an entry off the back or the end of a list. You know how to remove a specific entry from a list. You know how to insert a specific entry in a list. There's one last thing I want to do, and that is called iteration. So what if I wanted to get each of the values in here and do something with them? Access every single one of them and then do some operation that's repetitive. So a good example of using this would be like if you had a list of IP addresses and you're like, okay, for each of these IP addresses in this list, connect to this device. See what I'm saying? So although you wouldn't, in our course, it's not as simple as it will be for the device access, but it's an example. So the way you do it is you say for X in my list, print X. And you have each of these being output. And then if I were to say print, and again, F string, my current entry is X. Oops. And now I did that for every single one of these. So that's another example of F string. And this is a for loop. So you're probably wondering, what is X? X is simply an arbitrary value. That's simply what it is. It's an arbitrary value referenced out of my list for each iteration. So X is the current value that this for loop is iterating over. And then you take that value and you do something with it. And that's what I did here. I just passed an X to this string and then output this. So that should make sense. It's pretty simple. Now what we're going to do next is we're going to do dictionaries. Dictionaries will be the last piece of this. And then after we check out the dictionaries, what we're going to do is we're going to take this information that we've learned from here and we're going to apply it in, again, parsing this out. So the next thing is a dictionary. My dictionary, and a dictionary looks like this, little squiggly brackets. You could also do it this way. It's the same thing. So now the question is, how do you add values, key values? That's how a dictionary is laid out. A dictionary is sometimes referenced by other languages such as Java. You could call it a hash. Okay. But here, it is a dictionary, and in a dictionary contains a set of key value pairs. The key is always going to be an individual value. Or excuse me, the key is always going to be, it's always going to be an individual value, whereas the value can be any data type. So what I mean by that is, if I wanted to say, well, we'll start with a single value example. I want to say R1 is 1, 2, 3, 4, and maybe that's our management IP. Okay. If we look at the dictionary now, that is our key value pair. So this right here can only be one value at any given time. But this could be more than one value. So if I wanted to add a second entry here, and instead I want this to be a list, and maybe I want to have more than one entry, that is completely legal. Now, regarding this, I do not recommend that your format is inconsistent like this. Whatever your format is should be consistent throughout every entry, just like this is right here. This is consistent for every single entry you have. But it is completely legal. You can put a list in a dictionary, you can put a list in a list, you can put a dictionary in a dictionary in a dictionary. You could put a tuple in a list. There's a lot of different combinations. You're probably wondering why you would do that, but as you start seeing API responses and you start seeing JSON output, you're going to understand why it is important to know this. So now what I'm going to add one more value to this. I'm going to say my dictionary R3. Then we're going to add another entry here with a list this time. And the next question is, how do you access a specific entry? So you're not in a list anymore to where it's just a positional argument. What you have to do now is you have to have a key reference. So if I say print my dictionary R1, and it's going to give me the value of that key. And for our example with the list, you could say R2 and then a positional argument. Let's get the first entry in the list. That's the value of R2, and it gives us this one. Make sense? Okay. So the next thing we want to do is we want to learn how to remove an entry from our dictionary. And that is simply del my dictionary R1. And we no longer have R1 in there. Seems pretty simple, right? Okay, so I'm gonna add that value back real quick. And there's one other thing that I want to mention. When you're trying to access a dictionary entry, there's something very important that you want to do. If you have something you want to access, but you're not uncertain that all these entries may be in here. For example, there's no R4. So if there's no R4, you're going to get an error because there's no key. Makes sense, of course it makes sense. The problem with this is if you're iterating over these values and you have some pattern that you're trying to match. So for example, you're like, okay, if the key starts with R, for example, and I'm going to iterate, let's say I want to go R1 to R10, but there's no R4 key, regardless of how you spin it, a key error is going to throw everything off. So what you want to happen is, if R4 doesn't exist, then you have something to where you handle that and you identify it, and then you put it in a file saying R4 doesn't exist in the database. We cannot connect to R4 because we don't have the information we need. So what you do instead is you say print mydictionary.get R4, and it's going to give you a none value. Okay. My dictionary. Oh, the heck. Why is it all yellow now? Huh. All right, I fixed it. So where were we? Yeah. .get, mydict.get R4. So this is nice because, like I said, if it doesn't exist, it's not going to throw an error. Technically what you could do is you could catch the error, but that's not, again, it's not the most efficient thing to do. You just want to write it this way. So if it's set to none, then you can log that somewhere. All right. So now the next thing that you're probably wondering is, how do you update a value? And I mean, that's really, really simple. You just reference your key and you can easily update the value as you please. It's completely mutable. So then after you now know that, what I want to do next is show you iteration through a dictionary. Iteration is very simple in a dictionary, but not as simple as a list. So by default within a list, you would say something like for X in my list, and you say print X, right? Unfortunately, if you do this, it's only going to reference the key without the value, which is not what we want. We want the whole thing. So what you have to do is you have to have two variables here, X and Y, or whatever you please. And then at the end of this, you say dot items. And now you have your three items laid out in this manner. And you're probably wondering, how do I only access the keys or the values? That is quite easy. All you say is keys. Or you say values. Easy peasy. That should make sense for you at this point, hopefully. It's pretty straightforward. Most of these are operations that we will be doing within our little demo. I want to show you what this looks like firstly. So as you see here, it's just a bunch of dictionaries and lists that can be nested. So here you have a list nested inside this dictionary, and then you have a dictionary inside of a list. You have a set of dictionaries inside of a list. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take the file that I put all this in, and we're going to access it through Python. The way we do this is we say import JSON, and then we are going to open it. I'm trying to remember what the file name is called. Let's check that real quick. Okay. And then we put in R because we want to read only. And we will call the file X. And then we're going to load the JSON into a variable called myJSON. Oops. And now it's loaded, and if we print myJSON, as you see, this is very poorly formatted. This is not readable at all, so you're probably wondering, how do I make this way easier to read? And I'll tell you, pretty print. pprint. So now, if I say pprint.pprint myJSON, it looks much, much better. So now what we want to do is we want to drill down into this. I want to drill down multiple times. First thing is, what is of interest to us here? What do we want to access? We don't care about the count, we don't care about the next, we don't care about the previous, we care about the results. So now we say pretty print myJSON, reference to a dictionary. How did we do that? Put it in our little square brackets, and we say results. And now we are down to the results. Okay? Now what do we do next? What do we have here? We have a list, and inside the list is a dictionary. So how do we access a list? How do we access a position of the list? We use a number. Start with 0. And now we are in a specific entry of the list. Okay? So now, what do I want to get? Let's say I want to get the host name. What do I put in here? And actually, before I go any further, I got to make sure I adhere to the practice we had discussed earlier. .get. Now we're going to say .get name. Now we accessed a very specific entry in that. Okay? So now the next question is, how do let's say I want to access multiple values in every single entry. How do I do that? From here, how do I do that? And as we know, a for loop will help us iterate through all of the entries. So what we want to do is we want to say for entry in myJSON.get results, because we know that a level down from the results you have a list of entries. And then we say we're gonna set a couple variables. We're gonna say my device equals entry dot get device, or sorry, not device, name. And then we're gonna print that. And we're gonna actually, we'll pretty print it, even though we don't need that yet. But say here, we'll say device is my device. Okay. And now we have our device names. Now let's go back to what I showed you earlier, what you expect out of the complete output. We want it to look like this. So we have the device name, and I put just device. I should probably set that to device name just to keep it consistent. And then what was the other two that we had here? We had management IP and we had site So first we want to look through what are the keys that we have to access to get the site and the management IP. So where is the site at? Okay, so the site here, oh look, there's a dictionary that's in the site's value. Okay, so how do we reference that? Well, first we're going to set a variable, and we're going to say entry.get site. We're going to go one level under that, .get name. Okay. So then we'll add to this little dictionary down here, we will say site is equal to my site. I should keep these consistent. And now we have 2 of the 3 entries. So now we only need one more. We need the management IP. Entry.get. And what are we looking for here? Okay, so we have primary IP, and then again, this is in a dictionary, so we need primary IP, and then we need address. So primary IP dot get address, and that should be it. But we run into this error. So the question is, what is going on here? We know that this is laid out how it should be. We're getting an error. We know that the error is in this line. We just added this line, obviously. So the question is, what is it? Why are we getting this error? Because as you know, a .get will at least give you a none. Okay? So let's look up at the different data here, right? For the first one that I showed you, you're going to see there's an entry for the address. However, device B does not have a IP address set yet. As you see here, it is set to none. So technically, when you do a .get on primary IP, you're not going to get an error. But when you go a level lower to this .get address, you cannot do this if there's no management IP existing, because there's no dictionary data structure under primary IP. As you saw, it's just none. So the question is, how do you get around that? Okay, I want you to think about this for a second. How do you get around that? Why not use a conditional? And a conditional is an if then else. You've probably heard of if then else, maybe you haven't, but an if then else is if this condition meets this requirement, or if this condition does not meet this requirement, then do this or that. Okay, that's pretty much what an if then statement is. So I'm going to say if not entry.get primary IP management IP equals none. Now you want to make sure you have an else here and put this under it, because if you do not, what will happen is it'll just reassign the management IP variable to this, and then it will throw your error again. So the question is what I'm doing here. If not entry.get primary IP, what this means is if the entry.get primary IP is set to none, or if it doesn't exist, then I'm going to set it to none. Okay, and if you look up here, what is it set to? It is set to none. So, else, if there is a dictionary entry for primary IP of any kind, then get the address. And, oh, actually, before I proceed, I almost forgot I need to add this to the dictionary down here. And we have our final layout. And you will see that we now have every value, every key value pair here. And this is actually off. This is wrong. This is what you want. Is you want the none. Now in the course, we are going to intentionally have missing pieces like this because realistically speaking, in an operations environment, there is going to be data in your sources of truth that are missing. It's inevitable. If you're trying to iterate through 10,000, 20,000 devices, there's going to be data that you do not have. And what's going to happen if you don't have that data and you don't have something to catch that, your workflow is going to break, and then you have to start all over again when you may have already implemented certain things on some of the devices, depending on how the script is set up. But for the sake of the course, we're going to write it to where it is. I'm not going to say it's going to be foolproof, but there's going to be a lot of things, a lot of validation that comes in, so we prevent anything unnecessary. Okay? So hopefully this was informative. Hopefully this got you a good leg up on understanding how to get data out of a API response. And you can do this with any other API response as well. What we're going to do in the next video, and I would say that those who are not familiar with Python enough, but they know a little bit of Python, this may actually be useful to you. The next video is going to cover the requests library. And what the request library does is it's what makes an API call to your API and pulls that response. So we're not going to be pulling it out of a file. We're actually going to be calling it, and we're going to be retrieving it within Python. And then at the end of that video, we're going to take this, we're going to take all of this, and we're going to feed that API response into this right here, and you're going to get a parsed API response for your benefit. All right?